So give me your absolute best money-saving tip.
I have a great tip for our clients. So many people think that prenups are just for rich people. Hello, everyone. I'm Denise Isaacs, and I want to introduce you to Leah Mayersohn. We are two lawyers with over 60 years of experience.
Wait a minute. You don't need to tell them that it's 60 years of experience. I think they get the message. I don't really want anyone to know how old we are.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about prenups, and we're going to focus on the role of the lawyer and the role of the fiancé. And the question is it the lawyer destroyer, or are it the people themselves who ruin their own marriage and decide not to get married because there is going to be just, they can't agree on anything because there's so much conflict?
Well, sometimes it's not the client, and sometimes it's not the lawyer. Sometimes it's the adult parents of the client, and I see that a lot as well.
Oh, yes, yes. Do you find that it is the parents who hire you a lot or have hired a lawyer already to send you a prenup?
Yes, I would say in the majority of the prenups that I'm getting, it's the adult parents who have a lot of money and don't necessarily want their child to marry the person that they're marrying because they're apprehensive about it,
Yeah.
who want to retain the services of my law firm. And they're the ones who are driving things. And they're the ones who seem to be putting a wedge in between the fiance and their partner. And they're very concerned about what's going to happen with their money that they've worked for their entire lives in the future. And a lot of times, if there's a huge disparity,
Which is a lot of
which
times.
is a lot of the
A lot of
times.
the time.
You know, I see this a lot with the women that I represent, where their parents are extremely overprotective and they feel like the fiance is kind of a deadbeat, that they don't really have anything going for them or they haven't made anything of themselves.
Yes.
And the parents,
Yes. Yeah.
And the parents don't want to go ahead and feel like they have someone freeloading on what they're going to give them. And I had, I've had a lot of these types of cases, and I've had a few of them blow up. Now, on more than one occasion, I've said to the person, are you sure that this is the person you want to marry? And I've been on both sides of it. You know, I remember one case in particular where the client's parents were extraordinarily controlling and trying to force the client and the fiance to basically live practically on top of them. And my client was an educated professional, and the other person, their child, was not working. And if anything, their own child was the one who was kind of mooching off of the parents. But the parents were trying to control absolutely everything, down to they wanted rules about what was going to happen and naming of future kids.
Oh,
and this
my
was
God.
extreme. This
Oh,
was
wow.
ridiculous.
That is really extreme.
And I said to this person,
Yeah.
is this really how you want to live your life? And this person was very easygoing, and they weren't at the height of their career, but they were fairly successful already. And I said, do you really want these people to control your entire future life?
Right.
And the client thought about it for a while and finally called it off. And I actually was really relieved for the client that they called it off, because I thought this was going to be a complete disaster and that the client was going to be miserable. And the client seemed like a really nice person, and I was really stressed out about it.
Those parents were really, really over the top.
They were completely over the top, and their demands were outrageous, unenforceable, and illegal, and just showed that they weren't willing to respect the relationship at all at any point in the relationship. You know, with a lot of prenups, I say to people, you know, if you're married for a substantial amount of time, over time, you can certainly be more generous with the person.
Yes.
And you can eventually, I've had a lot of couples tear it up after they've been married a decade or 2 decades, depending upon the circumstance. Because if they're setting up their entire life together and earning stuff together, that other person is entrenched in their entire life and really part of it. And if they're trying to treat them as if they have absolutely nothing and no part of it, it's really disrespectful.
It's disrespectful, and it's the pathway to divorce. Onerous, terrible prenup in which one person, the have, keeps it and the have not gets nothing, it's going to lead to conflict and it's resentment all the time. All the
Absolutely.
time.
Absolutely. What's the worst prenup you've seen?
I had someone come into me. I had a woman come into me after being married for 20 years, and she got nothing. She got absolutely nothing because she was thinking about getting a divorce, and then she decided not to get a divorce because she would end up with nothing. Or very little, not nothing, but very, very little, considering the substantial property that her husband had. But I want you to tell me about inheritance because that's very, very important. And I want you to talk about the fairness of inheritance and parents having the right to worry about where the money they give their children goes.
This is something that happens a lot in terms of the consideration of the prenup process. And I certainly understand it because, if you've worked your entire life for something and you're going to leave a substantial inheritance to your child and potentially to your grandkids, I can understand them wanting to control a little bit of that and make sure that the other party isn't freeloading off of them and taking their money and running away and leaving their child or their grandkids without something significant. And, in Florida, for there are many different considerations that you have to have in a prenup regarding inheritance. And I see it from a number of different ways. Number one, with adult parents who are getting married, I see the adult children being very stressed about what's going to happen for them.
Right. So these are prenups where the children are worrying that they're going to lose their inheritance.
Correct.
When the parent gets remarried.
Correct. And I'm getting a lot of adult children coming to my office because all of a sudden their parent is in their 70s or 80s or even 90s and now has found the love of their life, or usually it's a much younger individual.
Or the caretaker all of a sudden,
or someone else that they're giving a lot of money to. And at that point, they're not incompetent. They don't meet the criteria for guardianship action, but they're influencing that person and causing them to spend recklessly. And the adult children might be worried about what's going to happen with their inheritance. And I think and it could be, a situation where, I've seen, I can't tell you how many cases where one parent has cheated on the biological mother of the adult children, and the adult children now come in because they're concerned that their parent is taking off with the secretary, the nurse,
the paramour,
whatever, the paramour. And that person is now going to capture their inheritance that they were counting on. Now, of course, people should never count on an inheritance.
But they do.
But it's a pretty rough way. They should always make their own way. But that being what it is, a lot of times you have these new relationships and all of a sudden the older parent goes and gets married and now they've disinherited their adult children that they've had their entire lives. Their adult kids might be in their 40s or their 50s or even their 60s. And this person they've known for 2 years. So it's extremely important that they go ahead and have a prenup. And the prenup has to be prepared properly with all the same statutory restrictions that you'll see in a will for it to be enforceable for the person that they're married to be giving up their rights to inheritance. Because in Florida, a spouse is entitled to 30% of the estate if you don't do a prenup. And that's something that your adult kids might not be counting on. It's less important when they're younger, but much more important when they're older.
Tell me what happens when they're remarried. Okay, the father remarries the paramour or remarries the caretaker. What happens? The prenup does what, and then how can the paramour or the caretaker get around that?
So what happens is if a lawyer doesn't properly prepare a prenup, and a lot of estate planning lawyers will go ahead and prepare a prenup, but they don't necessarily follow all of the rules and have full financial disclosure, have two witnesses and a notary there, and specifically disclaim inheritance rights in the prenup, then regardless of what the will says, they can go ahead and contest it when that parent goes ahead and passes away and fight for it. And I've seen it in a number of different cases. And I saw one case recently, crazy situation, and it was the caretaker who came in, who was living in the home. Father supposedly did a favor by getting married to this person. It was not a romantic relationship. It was specifically so that individual could get papers to stay in the U.S. because that person felt very worried. And the attorney who prepared the prenup in that case was, an estate attorney who was at the end of his practice. And unfortunately, he didn't put the right stuff in, and that cost the adult children a huge percentage of their inheritance. And one of them had needs that required it. And it was a terrible, terrible situation. We ended up litigating that in the probate courts, and it was just a terrible mess.
Leah, people think that prenups are just for the wealthiest people. Can you tell me how you think about that?
Absolutely not. Prenups are absolutely for everyone. And if you work hard for your assets and you work and you earn enough money to buy a home, why should you give that to someone else because you're in a short-term marriage? And I think that it's very important to plan for your future. Also, when you're starting your relationship, you don't know what is going to happen in your future. You don't know if your business is going to take off, if something will happen to you. You don't know what's going to happen with your inheritance. There are many different considerations that you can't foresee in the future that might happen 5 years out, 10 years out, 15, 20.
But you never know what's going to happen. You never know.
So it's better to protect yourself and to plan ahead. And I would recommend that everyone get a prenup. The statistics on divorce are tremendous. I mean, it's well over 50% of the population, over 70% in many different areas of all marriages end in divorce. And because of this, you should protect yourself. It's no different than anything else. There are many different ways we protect ourselves in our daily lives.
Like car insurance. You never know when you're going to have an accident.
100%. So I think it's very important that you go ahead and do this and make sure that you're taken care of. Because in the event you get divorced, you don't want to have arguments about it. You don't want to have to litigate and spend all that money on lawyers for something that you should have had from the beginning.
And let's talk about the different categories in a prenup. What you're talking about now is people own houses prior to the marriage. So many people have invested, they've saved from the time that they've been young to be able to buy a house, and they want to keep that house theirs forever. There's so many prenups that I've done that is the major asset, and their retirement assets. Their 401ks or IRAs. So
Absolutely.
Those are things that people really want, and they also, we talked about this before, they also want to protect their inheritance. And they need to talk to us because it's not only that inheritance is protected by Florida law, it's that they have to keep their inheritance in a separate account and not put any money in it to commingle. Okay, they cannot put any money that they're earning now into their inheritance, or they're not going to protect their inheritance. So it's not just that Florida law protects your inheritance, it's that you have to specifically act to make sure that your money that you inherited from your parents goes into a separate account and that you don't put any marital money in it.
Absolutely. I think people misunderstand commingling. I'm asked this question a lot as an attorney in different consults. And they said, oh, well, I just put my salary in it. I'm like, you've now commingled it.
Oh, God.
And you've turned an account that was a premarital account into a marital account. Now your spouse is entitled to half of it. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to get married, it's very important that you keep your premarital assets, including every single paycheck, in a separate account and open a new account and never put your spouse's name on the other
Yes.
account for any reason. I've had a number of situations where people said, well, I just put it there to pay the bills. Well, that doesn't matter. So, protect yourself if you can.
Right. So that means when you get married, you have your own new account and a joint account. That's what you have. And you keep your premarital accounts separate so that you keep all the money that you had prior to the marriage in separate accounts and you don't put any more money in it from your earnings. So you keep it separate, which keeps it only yours. Because we can prepare a prenup and then you can blow it by putting the other person's name on it. It's just the reason that you want a prenup is to keep what you had prior to the marriage, that house that you had prior to the marriage, that business that you had prior to the marriage will only be yours.
Now, one of the biggest questions that I'm asked by people when they're going to go ahead and get married and they want to do a prenup is how far in advance of the wedding should they be doing the prenup? And I have clients testing this all of the time. So I'd love to hear your take on this.
Okay, they call me up and it's 2 weeks. I tell them, don't come to see me. Do it, get married and come to see me afterwards because it's just not enough time. So what do I think? I think 6 months in advance, 4 months in advance. You need to have time to think about the concept of what is premarital, what you want to keep, and then you also need to think about what's fair and what is going to be marital. That's a very big consideration, and you both have to think about what the marriage is going to be and what the assets of the marriage are going to be. Are you going to accumulate everything that you had during the marriage and that's going to be marital, or is everything going to be separate?
Absolutely. And I think it's very important to do the prenups as far in advance of the wedding as possible so no one can claim that there's duress or undue influence or anything else that motivated them.
Right.
I've had a number of people who are saying, listen, I have the wedding coming up in a couple weeks. And I'm like, you can't get married. And they're like, well, I went ahead and sent the invitations out.
Yeah, and we sent the invitations out 4 months ago.
And
Really?
it's
And you
just-
didn't think about a prenup?
It seems to be an afterthought with a lot of people, and it shouldn't be an afterthought. And there are things that people can go ahead and do. Even if they make that terrible mistake, we could always do a post-nup later. And I've seen some very creative solutions to trying to make things enforceable if someone does that. And, we're putting together a prenuptial booklet so that
Yes.
we can talk to people about some of the top mistakes that they made or could avoid making. And I think, that's something that everyone who's thinking of getting married should have. So if you want a copy of that, just email us and we're happy to send that to you after this because we want to make sure that everyone has a good marriage and they're not stressed about it. I think the final thing we should be talking about with respect to prenups, though, is financial disclosure, because a lot of people make this horrible mistake and they'll go ahead and do a prenup, or I've seen a lot of them writing it up themselves, and then they don't have the proper financial disclosure. So can you talk about this?
If you are going to cheat, you don't want your spouse to know that you are very wealthy or how much money you have or how little money you have or how much debt you have. Lots of people have student loans that are humongous. And this is something that you can set aside an agreement. People want to know, are prenups solid, rock solid? Yes, they're rock solid if you disclose all your properties, if you disclose everything, if you leave something big out, it is a road to set aside the agreement. So that most agreements that are set aside because somebody left something important out. If it's just like a gold bracelet, nobody's going to set aside a prenup for a gold bracelet. But if they set aside monies that they had and they didn't disclose it, that is going to be a very big mistake. And so, penny foolish. What's
Penny
that say?
wise, pound foolish.
Right. Exactly.
Well, I had a case recently and I didn't prepare the prenup. I was reviewing it on behalf of my client and we kept waiting for the financial disclosure. And of course, it was way too close to the wedding, which wasn't my fault. And I was representing the person with less assets. And the person, didn't want to disclose to the fiance how much money he had. And this wasn't his first marriage. And he had been through it before and had been apparently raked through the coals and had,
That's what they
multiple
all say.
claimed and had
Giving up 50% of what you had is being raked through the coals.
and he had, multiple sets of children from multiple different marriages. And we got everything and we went through it. This is an attorney who practices family law in our community. And I had been asking this particular attorney for all the background documents. And she said that her client refused to provide her with all the documents. And I, of course, said, look, you know about full disclosure.
Right.
And we had the signing with the court reporter and the videographer and all that. And, my client said, look, I'm looking at this, but, I want the backup documents. And that client didn't get the backup documents. So she already raised an objection. I raised that objection. Things continued. We finished the signing. My client had indicated on the record that she wasn't satisfied with what she had received. And then afterwards, as we're getting ready to leave from everything, her client says to his attorney, the valuation of his company was completely off. I think that's such a huge mistake from his attorney's standpoint, because the first thing I'm going to do if my client divorces that person is to bring out the transcript and the video of what happened and talk about how there wasn't full and fair financial disclosure. And the significance of the improper valuation is that he didn't properly disclose to my client what his assets were. So she wasn't freely and voluntarily and in an informed manner going ahead and signing everything.
And the law says what the law tells you what can set aside an agreement.
If you don't have full and fair financial disclosure. And in this particular case, I think we already have it on the record to set aside the entire prenup, which is crazy. So what I like to do as a matter of course is I make the parties literally sign off that they've received all of the records. And I do all of the disclosure as if they were getting divorced. So they have 3 years worth of all credit card statements, all bank statements, brokerage statements, property records, the whole kit and caboodle. There's a lot more that I'm not talking about today, but absolutely everything. So no one can say that they just received a summary, that they misunderstood something. So thank you for listening and watching today. And if you wouldn't mind, please like, subscribe, and follow. And if you think you need a prenup, give us a call today and book an appointment. We can get you set up before you make any mistakes.
If you're thinking about getting married, call us.